All of our examples so far were using booleans. However, you can actually use any other value, such as integers or doubles or even strings. So let's try that now. I'm going to create an integer called number 1. I'm going to set it equal to 10. And then I'm going to set number 2 equal to 15. Now let's try our if statement. We're going to check if number 1 is equal to number 2. Now we're going to print out the if statement is correct. We can run the program and it's not going to print out anything because number 1 is not equal to number 2. What you can actually do, instead of just comparing the two things directly, you can check if one of them is bigger or smaller simply using bigger or smaller symbols. So if number 1 is bigger than number 2, print out the statement. Or you can do if is smaller, or you can make it more complicated and you can do if number 1 is smaller or equal to number 2. Run the program and it works because number 2 is indeed bigger than number 1. So now let's do something a bit more complicated. We're going to create a function which is going to check which one of the three numbers is the biggest one. So let's create our function. I'm going to call it isBiggest. And we're going to enter three integers into it. I'm going to call them num1, 2, and 3. Always remember to put the colon at the end of the function. And now we're actually going to create an if statement, which is going to check if number 1 is bigger or equal to number 2, and number 1 is bigger or equal to number 3. If number 1 is bigger both than number 2 and number 3, we're going to do what's inside of this if statement. So I'm going to print out number 1 is the biggest. Now we can create else if statements, checking all the other possibilities. So let's check if number 2 is the biggest now. If number 2 is bigger or equal to number 1 and number 2 is bigger or equal to number 3, we're going to print out number 2 is the biggest. However, if neither of these are true, which means number 1 is not the biggest and number 2 is not the biggest, then we're going to else else. I actually forgot to put elif, I just put if, I'm sorry about that. And now we're actually going to put the else statement over here. And there's only one option left, and it's the number 3 being the biggest, because we already covered the other two options. So we're going to print number 3 is the biggest. And now we're actually going to call our function. Remember, to call a function, you have to put its name. And then you have to pass on its parameters onto it. So let's give it random numbers like 9, 3, and 11. And let's run the program. And it's printing out number 3 is the biggest, and that is correct. Let's try number 1 to be the biggest. Number 1 is the biggest. And then let's check if number 2 can be the biggest as well. And as you can see, it works. We just created a basic function which checks 3 numbers and tells us which one of them is the biggest one. Now let me just modify it a little bit. Instead of actually printing out the text, we're going to return the number which was the biggest. So we're going to return num1. Here we're going to return num2 and return num3. Now remember, when you're actually returning stuff, this is what's being changed into that returned value. So we have to actually do something with it, and I'm going to print it out. Run the program, and it's printing out 1 to 3 because it's the biggest number. Remember, in the if statements, you can not only check booleans and numbers like I just shown you, but you can also check strings, of course. So we could, for example, check like banana and then equals another string called banana, and it's going to equal to true because this string is equal to this one. Try to experiment a bit with the if statements, see what you can come up with. And one actually pretty useful operator I forgot to mention is exclamation mark equals, which this basically check if num1 isn't equal to number 2. Just wanted to mention that because I forgot about it earlier. And yeah, that would be it. See ya.